Quick Man Tan. Everybody called him Quick Man Tan when he was a young man. That was a long time ago. Now people called him by his real name, Caleb Tan. Caleb liked to talk about the old days. He talked to anybody who was interested. He told them that when he was younger he could catch a fly in his hand. That was how quick he was. Sometimes tourists came to his cafe for coffee or maybe some chicken with rice. When they had a meal was best. Then Caleb had more time to tell them how quick he once was. I was the best, he told them. And just to show them, he moved his hands in the air. He moved like the fighters in kung fu films. Nobody could fight like me, he always said. I was the best in Singapore. But he wasn't very quick now. He still knew what to do, but he was slower. Usually, people smiled at him and finished their chicken with rice. But sometimes someone told Caleb he was a stupid old man. At those times, he went back into the kitchen and May, his wife, talked to them. Please don't mind my husband, she laughed to them. He just likes to think of the old days. He was good when he was young, but he's old now. He forgets. She laughed, but she didn't feel happy. Caleb Tan was 70 years old. He had photographs of the Chinese lion dance all over the walls of his cafe. He was once a lion dancer himself. He danced with the best. He was the best. Everyone said so. Years ago, everybody wanted Quick Man Tan to dance the lion dance for them. It was their favorite dance, and Caleb could dance it better than anybody else. At Chinese New Year, he was everybody's favorite dancer. He danced under a big Chinese lion's head made of paper. He moved his feet in a quick and beautiful way that everybody loved. Then, after the dance, he did some fight moves. They looked like dances too. Caleb loved all the moves, but most of the fighting he did was in his head. He thought about fighting, but he didn't often fight. He really could fight with his hands and feet, but he didn't fight very often, only once or twice. That was enough for Caleb. He preferred to dance. He didn't really like fighting people, but he did like talking about it. That was what he liked to do now, talk about the old days. The cafe was his business, but all Caleb wanted to do was talk. As he got older, his hearing got worse and his voice got louder. Caleb talked to anybody who wanted to listen. Sometimes he talked when people didn't really want to listen. May knew that most of the things he said were not true, but Caleb believed it all. It was more real to him than his business was. To Caleb, his cafe was just a place where he could tell stories. But May knew they needed the cafe. It made them just enough money to live on. Sometimes Caleb did a lion dance with children who were interested. He was slow, but you could see how good he once was. All the children liked to see the old man. He was something from the old days. There were not many like him around now. Chinese New Year was always a busy time for everybody. It was one of the few times of the year when the cafe could do good business. May worked more than ever at New Year. This year she really wanted Caleb to help her. She couldn't do everything. Sometimes people left the cafe after waiting too long for their food. All Caleb did was talk. People wanted their coffee and lunch, not his stories. For Caleb, Chinese New Year was his favorite time. He had lots of people to listen to his stories. Sometimes other lion dancers came to the cafe. Then he shouted with happiness as he told them how to dance, and of course, how he could dance better than anybody else. "You see, my friends," called out Caleb to a table full of bored tourists, "it's all in the way you move, like a circle. like a wheel, like this." And Caleb then turned round with his hands in front of him. His hands went right into May and what she was carrying. The food was for a table full of tourists next to him. Everything fell to the floor. May did her best to help the tourists, but they left. Other people left too. For once, Caleb was quiet and helped her. May was unhappy. "It's not right," May told her husband that night. "While you tell your stories, I do all the work. There is too much for me and Henry to do." Henry was the cook. He was also their only son. He cooked everything. He was very good, but he had a lot to do in the kitchen. He needed someone to help him. Henry dreamed of having the cafe to himself one day. He was already 40 years old and still not married. There was no wife to help. There were no grandchildren to do little jobs. There was not enough money to pay for help. Henry was a little like his father. He had his dreams, but he kept his dreams about the cafe to himself. In his head, he was always far away while he worked, but now Henry was asleep. He couldn't hear his parents shouting. He couldn't hear Caleb tell May to be quiet. He couldn't hear the hurt in his mother's voice. All Henry could hear was the sound of cooking in his dreams. The words Gong Shi Fa Chai were written in red and yellow letters all over Singapore. This was Chinese for Happy New Year. Sometimes old friends of Caleb and May left hongbao in the cafe at this time. Hongbao are little red bags, usually with money inside. People always did this at Chinese New Year. Sometimes people left money, sometimes not, but they always left something. Poorer friends left oranges in place of money. Oranges are lucky. But May was pleased when they got money. They always needed money. This year they got a lot of oranges. Henry and May wanted the cafe to do well this new year. Henry worked very hard. He cooked more good food than he usually did. Lots of people came to the cafe, and Caleb couldn't talk to all of them. May smiled a lot. She was busy, but she was happy. Maybe business was getting better after all. This time Caleb did try to help. He brought coffee and food to the tables. He smiled as he worked. But then, a young father with his children asked about the lion dance photographs on the walls. Caleb stopped what he was doing. He started to talk. May heard him, but she couldn't stop him. She was too busy. She wanted Caleb to get back to work before he did anything stupid. It was early afternoon, and there were lots of hungry people in the cafe. It was hot. But that didn't stop the rain. The rain started all at once. It came down and down on the roof of the cafe and made a loud, heavy sound. More people came in. They wanted to get out of the rain and have something to eat or drink. Caleb was happy. He could tell his stories while people stayed out of the rain. They could enjoy a good story while they ate their lunch. Why not? He thought it was good for business. A young father and his 2 small children listened as Caleb talked. And talked. And talked. They were getting hungry. Caleb started to show them moves from the lion dance. "You turn, like a wheel. See?" Caleb told them in a loud voice. His hands moved in front of him. His feet moved too. People were looking at him. Not all of them knew what he was doing. It just looked strange to them. And all the time the heavy rain fell. By this time the cafe was full of people, and all the tables were full. Some people were standing. They just wanted to be out of the rain. There wasn't much room for May to do her work. People were talking and enjoying themselves while the rain fell outside. Then a large young man pushed his way into the cafe. He was wearing a big jacket and he was very wet. His right hand was under his jacket and a bag was in his left hand. It was a travel bag, the kind tourists use to put passports and money in. The man looked afraid, and he looked around him all the time. By mistake, he pushed against a table. The man at the table was reading a magazine. "Hey, watch where you're going," said the man with the magazine in an angry voice. But the large young man brought his hand out from under his jacket. He had a dangerous-looking knife in it. He held the knife against the face of the man with the magazine. "You just shut your mouth," he shouted. "See this knife? Don't start anything." As the young man spoke, he turned around with the knife. He was talking to everybody in the cafe now. He sounded afraid. He looked dangerous. People put down their things and looked at him. They were all afraid. The cafe went quiet as the rain fell. "Yes, feet too, just like a wheel," said Caleb in a loud voice. He turned as he spoke and his foot moved quickly up into the air. His foot hit the big man's hand and the knife flew up into the air. "Why, you stupid old man," the young man shouted. Caleb smiled. He remembered his old fighting moves. In a minute, the young man was on the floor. Somebody used a mobile phone to call the police. Soon they arrived and took the young man away in the rain. A few minutes later, the rain stopped. The newspapers were full of the story the next day. Quick Man Tan was once more in the news. The young man was a robber. The bag he had with him was a tourist's. That was why he ran to the cafe. He didn't want the police to find him. "But he didn't know about Quick Man Tan," said the young father in the newspaper story. "I saw it all with my 2 children. He just moved his foot in the air and then the knife flew away. He was just like Jackie Chan in the films. The children will never forget this. He was great." There were lots of Hong Bao for Caleb and Mei Mei after that. All of them had money inside. There was a lot of money this time. With the money, Mei Mei found somebody to help with the cafe. Her name was Elizabeth and she was a cook. Elizabeth and Henry worked very well together. People asked Caleb to teach the lion dance to children. So that's what he did all the time now. He got paid for it too. He didn't work at his cafe anymore. He left that to Henry and Mei Mei. But he was happy. Henry and Elizabeth got married a year later. The famous Quick Man Tan did the lion dance on that day. He wasn't quite so quick now, but nobody minded that. "Turn like a wheel," he laughed while he danced with the children. "Like a wheel." The wheel on the wall. "Well, just take a look at that wheel," Earl Cooper said to Candy, his wife. "It must be much older than anything we have back home." When Earl Cooper traveled, he always thought of home. But there weren't many really old buildings in Texas. Now he was in Portsmouth in the south of England. Portsmouth, Earl knew, was one of the best places to see old ships. Earl liked old things. They were staying at a pub which was very near to the sea. They could see lots of ships from the pub. That's why they liked it. Earl was looking at the wall outside the pub. The pub's name, the Old Swan, was on the wall. Next to the name was a wooden ship's wheel, and in the middle of the wheel was the name of a ship, HMS Swan. The wheel was old, Earl could tell. And it was there, just above his head. The Old Swan was hundreds of years old. Earl knew because it said so on the sign by the wheel. It said that in the past, sailors used the pub before they went to sea. Now the pub sold food and drink to tourists. They watched the ships and listened to the seabirds while they ate their meals. Earl Cooper was 60 years old, and both of his children, Marilou and Earl Jr., were parents themselves. Earl didn't work anymore. He had enough money. More than enough. Earl looked at the sign again. It told him how the oldest part of the pub was from 1350. The pub was bigger now, of course, but all of it was old. How can a place be so old, thought Earl, and it was still being used? Are you getting ideas again, honey? Asked Candy. They always called each other honey. You and your ideas. Sometimes you're just like a little boy, you big old thing. Candy liked to say things like that, but she liked him just as he was. Her husband loved finding out about the past. Earl knew all about his family name of Cooper. The family came from Portsmouth. That was why they were on holiday there now. The last Cooper to live in Portsmouth was his great-grandfather, Benjamin Cooper. Benjamin sailed from Portsmouth in 1875 at the age of 19. He wanted to make himself rich in America. He didn't make himself rich, but he had a good life. Benjamin died in Texas when he was 63 years old in 1919. It was just after the end of the First World War. Benjamin was waiting for his son, Ralph, to come back from the war in Europe. Just before Benjamin died, Ralph came back to America. He only had one arm now, but he had a new wife. Ralph was Earl's grandfather. Ralph Cooper always remembered the old things he saw in Europe in the war. He just loved stories about the past. He gave that love of the past to his children and to Earl. Earl was always his favorite grandson. Ralph told Earl lots of stories about Old England. Other children heard cowboy stories from their grandfathers. Earl got Old England. Earl remembered Ralph. And here I am, he thought to himself, standing in front of one of the oldest buildings I've ever seen. Not only that, it's in the very place where my great-grandfather Benjamin Cooper came from. Earl knew something else, too. Benjamin Cooper came to America on a sailing ship called the Swan. It was already an old ship in 1875, and Earl thought that there was nothing left of it now. But now he knew there was something left of the old ship. And there it was, the wheel on the wall of the Old Swan pub. Earl knew he wanted the wheel. He wanted to take it home to Texas. It was a part of his family history. It had to be his. Earl and Candy had a good meal that evening, some fine English beer, and then a good night's sleep. When he woke up, Earl knew just what to do. He told Candy all about it while they were eating breakfast. You know, honey, that ship's wheel is from old Benjamin Cooper's ship. I just know it. That's why I want to take it back home. I understand, honey, Candy answered with a smile. But it's part of this pub now. I know, said Earl with a loud laugh. But we can buy it. What do you think, Candy? Earl looked very happy, and everyone in the room heard his laugh. People were looking at him. But honey, asked Candy, what if they don't want to sell? What if they don't want anybody else to have their ship's wheel? After all, they've had it for all these years. It could be very expensive. They don't give things like that away for nothing, you know. I've thought about that, honey, Earl replied. And I agree with you. But everything has a price, and I've got the money. Hey, they're a business, aren't they? They understand money all right, you just wait and see. After breakfast, Earl asked to see Tony Thatcher. The Old Swan was Tony's pub. Tony was a small, thin man with a big smile. He wore nice clothes and was always friendly to the people who came to his pub. With rich tourists, he was very friendly. His red Jaguar sports car was usually outside the pub. It was what they call a classic car. It was old and cost a lot of money. Tony Thatcher took Earl to his office while Candy had a coffee outside by the river. Earl said he could give Tony a lot of money for the ship's wheel. He told Tony about Benjamin Cooper and his family history, but Tony said no at first. After all, the wheel was very old, and it was part of the pub's past. "You can think of the past, Mr. Thatcher. Can I call you Tony? Or you can think of today. And with the money, Tony, you can buy another sports car. Maybe another old Jaguar? And, as I've told you, the wheel is part of my family's past too. So you could say it's going back home in a way. So, what do you say?" A month later, Earl and Candy were smiling as they looked at the wall of their house in Houston, Texas. Earl thought to himself that at last he had a piece of his family's past. He was happy. In Portsmouth, Tony Thatcher was happy too. He was putting another Jaguar into his large garage. He was careful not to drive into any of the 6 ship's wheels in the garage. A friend of his made the wheels for him. They were just like the one that Earl bought. And there was another wheel on the outside wall of the old Swan now. Old or new, Tony thought there was no way that a tourist could ever know which was which. Never in 100 years. Special Clay Emilio Lopez was a boy with problems. His family was poor, and they didn't know what to do with him. He was 13 years old, but his parents still couldn't find the right school for him. Not anywhere in Cleveland, Ohio in the USA. So far, not one of the schools wanted to have Emilio. They just couldn't help a boy with his difficulties. That's what the schools all said. Emilio was not a bad boy. He just got very angry sometimes. He got angry when he didn't understand things. He didn't like things that he couldn't understand. Not understanding something made him afraid, and being afraid made him angry. He was a big boy for his age, too. His teachers didn't find it easy to stop him when he got angry. But he wasn't the kind of boy who liked to get into fights. No, he usually broke things or sent furniture flying across the room. But breaking things could be dangerous. He could hurt somebody, or himself, doing things like that. His parents were very unhappy about their son. They wanted to do the best for him. But they knew that one day he could get into real difficulties. Then a doctor from a university came to see Emilio. He was somebody who knew all about the kind of problems Emilio had. He said Emilio needed special help. The doctor said Emilio needed to go to a special school where there were young people like him. The students lived at the school. His parents were pleased to hear that the school was free. It was also good for them for Emilio to be away from home for a while. His father and mother loved Emilio, but they also had 3 other children to look after. Emilio didn't say a lot, but everybody knew he was intelligent. He found it difficult to make friends or talk to people. He wanted to talk. Everybody knew that. But there was something that stopped him. It was like there was a wall there that was too high for him to get over. This wasn't easy for him. And sometimes not being able to say what he meant made him angry. That was the biggest problem. Then there were other times when Emilio couldn't stop talking. But the things he talked about were things few people wanted to know about. When Emilio got interested in something, he talked about nothing else. And Emilio got interested in things like car numbers, or railway trains, or the names of all the players in his favorite baseball team for the last 30 years. This made it difficult for anybody to have a real conversation with Emilio. Most people got very bored after the first half hour. And when people got bored, Emilio got angry. The special school was on the far side of Cleveland. It was a nice place, and the teachers were kind too. They taught all of the usual things at the school, but the classes were a lot smaller. Things didn't look very different to Emilio, at first. And at first, he was just the same as ever. After a while, he found he liked maths and science. But his favorite class was drama. The teacher Emilio liked best was Mrs. McPhee, the drama teacher. She was small and round, and she was 63 years old. She had white hair and a big smile. Emilio was tall and thin. He had black hair and a sad look on his face. Emilio was a lot taller than Mrs. McPhee. Teacher and student couldn't be more different to look at, but they liked each other at once. Mrs. McPhee's drama classes let Emilio be himself. He could be angry if he wanted. It was okay. But that didn't happen very often now. Mrs. McPhee made everything into a game they could all play. Everybody knew what to do in her classes. Emilio liked that. He liked things he could easily understand. He also liked the games they played in the drama classes. His favorite game was one Mrs. McPhee called Special Clay. In the school pottery classes, Emilio used real clay to make things. But Mrs. McPhee's special clay was different. "Right," Mrs. McPhee told the students. "Here is some special clay. Why is it so special? I'll tell you why. It's because you can make it into anything you like. It can be big, it can be small, it can be a car, a baseball bat, anything. But, most of all, you must see the thing in your head just as if it was in front of you. Then, in a very careful way, you make the thing with your hands. After that, you show us how to use it. Then, once you've finished, you just make the thing small again and put it back into your pocket." But Mrs. McPhee had no clay. There was nothing there. Her hands were empty, but nobody ever said so. It was all real to them at the time. Emilio believed it more than anybody. He was always most careful to make things just right. And when his car or his boat or his guitar was ready, it was just as if it was really there. And not just for Emilio. Everybody else in the class believed it too. Until the game was over. For those few minutes, Emilio couldn't be happier. Things got better for Emilio. Nobody said he could be just like everybody else. But, for the first time ever, Emilio felt he could do something with his life. To Emilio and everybody who knew him, that meant a lot. Mrs. McPhee's drama classes also helped Emilio with his anger. Before then, his anger was like a wall in front of his mind. It was a problem he couldn't get over. But now, at last, his anger was a problem he could do something about. Emilio's teachers soon found that he was very good at pottery. He could make things out of clay that were quite beautiful. He made little people and animals that looked just like the real thing. But you always knew they were made by Emilio. There was something about them that you couldn't mistake for anyone else's work. By the time Emilio was nearly 16, he was doing very well at school. He still had problems, but he was much better than before. He was also becoming well known as a good young potter. People already wanted to buy the things he made. He could make quite a lot of money from pottery. Everybody was sure. Mrs. McPhee knew Emilio could learn to be a great potter. All he needed was the right teacher. Mrs. McPhee wanted to make sure he got that teacher. She had a friend who was a well-known potter. His name was Grover Jackson, and he had a pottery studio which was next to Lake Erie. Grover was the best potter she knew, and a good teacher. He made the kind of things in clay that Emilio loved. Grover also liked to see good young potters work at his studio. Mrs. McPhee and his parents took Emilio to see Grover. The boy and the potter liked each other right away. Grover said Emilio could be a fine potter. Emilio could work with him. He could learn from him and stay in a room at his studio. He said Emilio could sell anything he made and could make some money. This was good news for Emilio and his parents. Emilio, of course, loved the studio and couldn't wait to start work. But first he had to go home and get his things ready. Mrs. McPhee had a big green and white car. It was 30 years old, and people often told her to get a new car. But she never did. She liked old things. She said she could take Emilio and his things to Grover's studio in her old car. There was lots of room in it. Emilio's parents liked Mrs. McPhee and were happy for her to help. The day came at last when Emilio was ready to go. He knew how important this day was, not only to himself, but to his family as well. And of course to his good friend Mrs. McPhee. Thanks to her, he wasn't just another boy with problems. That's what he thought. And he was probably right. Emilio still had some problems, of course. Talking to people still wasn't easy for him. But he could look after himself now. He could cook and clean, and knew how to drive a car. It was still early in the morning when Mrs. McPhee's old green and white car arrived. Emilio and his family were already waiting outside. His family were all feeling both sad and happy at the same time. Emilio felt the same way. He was sad to leave but happy to go. Emilio put his few things into the car. After saying goodbye to his family, Emilio and Mrs. McPhee were off. The pottery studio was about an hour's drive away from Emilio's home. Everything was fine. Mrs. McPhee was a careful driver, and the day was warm. Soon they could see the blue waters of Lake Erie through the open windows of the car. But after a while, the waters of the lake began to turn gray. The sky became dark. It began to rain. Mrs. McPhee turned her car into the road that led to Grover's studio. She knew they were now only a few kilometers away. The rain didn't stop. It got worse. They closed all the car windows. Soon the heavy rain made it very difficult to see the road.